I didn't plan to think about it that night. It just appeared the way certain thoughts do when the day finally quiets down. Not loud, not urgent, just present enough that ignoring it suddenly feels more difficult than listening. It was a Tuesday evening, and nothing unusual had happened. Work ended the way it always does. A slow fading of energy around the office sometime after 4. People finishing small tasks, shutting down computers, talking about traffic before leaving. The kind of ending that feels less like a conclusion and more like the day quietly stepping aside. I drove home through the same streets I've used for years. Same intersections. Same gas station with a flickering sign. Same grocery store parking lot where people push carts toward their cars under the yellow lights. Routine has a strange way of hiding things from you. When life repeats itself enough times, you stop asking questions about it. You start moving through the hours almost automatically, like your body already knows the path before your mind does. For a long time, I believed that was a good thing. Stability, consistency, proof that things were working the way they were supposed to. But that evening, as I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, I sat there longer than usual. The house was dark. A faint wind moved through the trees across the street. And for a few seconds, the silence inside the car felt heavier than normal. Not uncomfortable, just noticeable. Inside the house, everything looked exactly the same as it had the night before. The kitchen light above the sink. The chair slightly pulled away from the table where I had left it in the morning. A glass in the drying rack. Ordinary details. The kind you stop seeing after living somewhere long enough. I set my keys down and walked into the living room. Usually the first thing I do is turn on the television. Not because I want to watch something specific, just because the background noise fills the space in a way silence doesn't. But that night I didn't. I sat down on the couch and let the quiet stay where it was. At first my mind moved through the normal thoughts that follow a workday. What to eat for dinner? Whether I should answer a few emails tonight or wait until morning. The weather forecast for the weekend. But underneath those ordinary thoughts was something else. Something I had been avoiding for a long time without fully realizing it. A sentence. Not spoken, not written, just existing somewhere in the back of my mind, like an unfinished conversation. I noticed it the way you notice a sound in another room. At first it's vague, just enough to make you pause. Then slowly it becomes clearer. The sentence wasn't complicated. It was actually very simple. There's something about my life I've never said out loud. That was it. No explanation. No immediate meaning. Just the quiet awareness that something important had stayed unspoken for years. And once the thought appeared, it refused to leave. I got up and went to the kitchen. Sometimes moving around helps clear your head. Small tasks, simple routines. The physical motion gives your thoughts somewhere else to go. I poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. Its headlights moved across the wall for a moment before disappearing. The silence returned again, and with it, that unfinished sentence. There's something about my life I've never said out loud. The strange part was that I didn't immediately know what it referred to. You would think a realization like that would come with a clear explanation, but it didn't. It felt more like discovering a closed door inside a house you've lived in for years. You know the door is there now. You just don't know what's behind it yet. For a while, I tried to think through my life the way people normally do. Work, family, past relationships, old decisions. I searched for something dramatic, a mistake, a regret, some unresolved conflict that had been sitting quietly in the background. But nothing obvious appeared. My life, at least on the surface, had followed a fairly normal path. School, a decent job, a few relationships that ended peacefully enough. Friends I still talk to every now and then. Nothing unusual, nothing tragic, and yet the feeling remained that something important had gone unsaid. Later that night, I stepped outside for some air. The neighborhood was quiet. Most of the houses had their lights off already. A dog barked somewhere down the block, and then stopped. The air felt colder than I expected. I stood on the small patch of grass near the driveway and looked up at the sky. A few clouds moved slowly across the moon, and standing there in that quiet street, I realized something strange. The sentence in my mind wasn't asking me to remember something. It was asking me to admit something. There's a difference. Remembering is passive. It happens when the past shows up on its own. Admitting something is different. It requires you to look directly at a truth you've been carefully walking around. I stayed outside for a while, long enough for the wind to pick up slightly, long enough for the quiet pressure in my chest to become noticeable again. It wasn't panic. It wasn't even sadness. It felt more like standing at the edge of a thought you haven't allowed yourself to finish. Eventually, I went back inside. The house felt even quieter now. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water still in my hand and stared at the surface of the table. The wood grain moved in slow lines across the surface, patterns formed by time and pressure. And for the first time that evening, the sentence changed. It became slightly clearer. Not completely, but enough to feel closer to the truth. The thought was no longer just about something I hadn't said. It was about something I hadn't allowed myself to fully understand. A memory appeared then, not a dramatic one, just a small moment from a few months earlier. I was sitting with a group of coworkers after work. Someone had asked a simple question, the kind people ask casually without thinking too much about it. Are you happy with how things turned out? Everyone laughed a little when they heard it. The question sounded bigger than the room. Most of the answers were quick. Yeah, things are good. Could be worse. You know life. When it was my turn, I gave the same kind of answer. Something easy, something neutral. But now, sitting alone at my kitchen table months later, I remembered the strange pause that happened inside my mind right before I answered. A very small pause, so small that no one else would have noticed it. But I did, because during that pause, a completely different answer had briefly appeared in my mind. One I didn't say. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. The quiet pressure in my chest returned again, but this time it carried a slightly different feeling. Not confusion, recognition, like I was getting closer to something I had quietly avoided for years. The unfinished sentence had been following me for most of my adult life. It had appeared during certain conversations, certain quiet nights, certain moments when someone asked a question that felt just a little too honest. And every time it appeared, I had done the same thing. I had stepped around it, chosen the safer answer, the simpler story. Sitting there in the dim kitchen light, I realized something uncomfortable. Maybe the thing I had never said out loud wasn't hidden because it was complicated. Maybe it was hidden because it was simple. Simple truths are sometimes the hardest ones to say, because once you say them, you can't pretend you didn't know them before. I finished the glass of water and set it down on the table. The room was completely silent now. No television, no music, just the soft sound of the refrigerator humming somewhere behind me. And for the first time that night, I felt certain about one thing. Whatever that unspoken truth was, it wasn't going to stay quiet forever. Something inside me had started moving toward it. Slowly, carefully, the way you approach a door you've avoided opening for years. Not because you're afraid of what's behind it, but because you know that once it opens, the rest of the house might start to look different. And part of you isn't sure you're ready for that yet. The next morning started the same way most mornings do. An alarm that felt too early. Coffee that tasted stronger than it needed to be. A quiet kitchen filled with the soft blue light that comes just before the sun fully rises. From the outside, nothing about the day looked unusual, but something inside me felt slightly unsettled. Not anxious, just aware. That unfinished thought from the night before was still there. Not loud enough to interrupt my routine, but present enough that I could feel it moving somewhere behind everything else. There's something about my life I've never said out loud. Now that I had noticed it, I couldn't push it back into the background the way I had done before. The drive to work felt longer that morning. Traffic moved slowly through the intersections, red lights stopping the same line of cars again and again. I watched people in the cars around me. A man drinking coffee from travel mug. Someone adjusting the radio. A woman staring straight ahead with both hands on the wheel like she was deep in thought. Thousands of separate lives moving in quiet parallel. And suddenly I wondered something I had never asked before. How many of them were carrying thoughts they never said out loud? Not secrets exactly, just truths that felt inconvenient to admit. Work didn't give me much space to think. Emails, reports, small meetings where people talk about problems that look important inside the room, but disappear the moment you walk outside. Daniel stopped by my desk around midday. He leaned against the divider like he always does. "You look like you're solving a mystery," he said. "Do I?" "Yeah. That face usually means you're thinking about something too hard." I smiled a little. "Just didn't sleep much." "That's what coffee is for," he said, lifting his cup slightly. For a moment he stayed there, looking like he was about to say something else. Then he shrugged. "Well, if you figure out the mystery, let me know." He walked away before I could answer, and I realized something strange. He wasn't wrong. It did feel like I was trying to solve something. The only difference was that the mystery wasn't outside my life. It was somewhere inside it. The afternoon passed slowly. At one point I caught myself staring at the computer screen without actually reading anything. The words blurred together, and that memory from the night before returned again. The conversation with my coworkers months earlier. The simple question someone had asked, "Are you happy with how things turned out?" At the time, I had answered automatically, but now I remembered that small pause in my mind before I spoke. A fraction of a second. A space where a different answer had appeared and then disappeared again. I tried to remember exactly what that answer had been. Not the safe one I said out loud. The other one. The honest one. For a long time it stayed, just out of reach, like a word you almost remember, but can't quite bring back. Then, sometime late in the afternoon, it finally returned. Not dramatically, just a quiet sentence forming in the back of my mind. The answer I almost gave that day had been simple. "I'm not sure this is the life I expected." That was it. Nothing extreme. Nothing tragic. Just uncertainty. But sitting there at my desk months later, I realized why I hadn't said it. Because once you admit something like that, the conversation changes. People start asking questions. Questions you might not be ready to answer. After work, I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove slowly through a part of town I hadn't visited in years. It wasn't far from where I grew up. The streets looked smaller than I remembered. The same houses were still there, a little older now, paint fading slightly, trees growing taller in front yards. Memory has a strange way of preserving places exactly as they were. But real places keep moving forward. I parked the car near the small park where I used to spend time when I was younger. The swings were empty. The basketball court had a few cracks running through the concrete. I sat on a bench and looked around. For a while I tried to remember the version of myself who used to walk through this park. What he expected from life. What he believed adulthood would look like. When you're younger, the future always feels wide open. Every path looks possible. You imagine your life becoming something very specific. A certain kind of success. A certain kind of happiness. Not in great detail. Just a general direction. And somewhere along the way, life slowly rearranges those expectations. Not in a dramatic way. More like a quiet negotiation. You make practical choices. Reasonable compromises. You build stability piece by piece. And before you notice it, the life you're living isn't the one you imagined years ago. It's just the one that formed gradually while you were busy moving forward. Sitting on that bench, I realized something uncomfortable. The thought I had almost admitted months earlier wasn't really about disappointment. It was about distance. Distance between the life I once pictured and the one that quietly assembled itself around me. Neither one was necessarily better. They were just different. And I had never allowed myself to fully acknowledge that difference. The sun started to set while I was sitting there. Shadows stretched across the empty basketball court. A few people walked their dogs along the sidewalk nearby. Normal life continuing around me. But inside my head, the unfinished sentence was getting closer to the truth. There's something about my life I've never said out loud. Now it felt less mysterious. More specific. The truth wasn't that my life was bad. It wasn't even that I was unhappy. The truth was simpler than that. I had built a life that made sense. But I had never stopped to ask whether it felt like mine. The thought stayed with me the entire drive home. Street lights flickered on one by one as evening settled over the city. For the first time in a long while, my routine felt slightly unfamiliar. Not wrong, just newly visible. Like seeing the structure of something you've been standing inside for years. When I got home, the house was dark again. I turned on the kitchen light and stood there for a moment without moving. The silence felt different tonight. Not heavy, just honest. That quiet pressure in my chest returned again, but now it carried something else with it. Clarity. The truth I had avoided saying wasn't dramatic at all. It was simply this. For years, I had been living a life that worked, but I had never stopped to ask if it was the life I would have chosen if I had been paying closer attention. I sat down at the kitchen table again, the same place where the thought had started the night before. And this time, I didn't avoid it. I let the sentence exist exactly as it was. No excuses, no explanations, just a quiet recognition that something important had been left unspoken for a very long time. But now that I had finally heard it clearly, I knew something else too. Admitting a truth to yourself is only the first step. The harder part comes afterward, because once you see your life honestly, the next question arrives almost immediately. And that question was already beginning to form in the quiet space of the room. If this wasn't exactly the life I expected, then what was I going to do with the one I had? That night, after I admitted the truth to myself, I expected something to happen. Not something dramatic exactly, but at least some kind of direction. A feeling that the next step would become obvious once the truth was finally out in the open. But nothing like that arrived. The house was quiet. The kitchen light hummed softly above the table, and I sat there with the realization resting in front of me, like an object I had just discovered but didn't yet understand how to use. For years, I had believed that clarity would automatically lead to change. But sitting there in the quiet room, I realized something else. Clarity doesn't always give you answers. Sometimes it just removes the stories you were hiding behind. The sentence that had followed me for so long was no longer vague. It had finally taken shape. I had built a life that made sense. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped asking whether it was the life I truly wanted. It wasn't a painful realization. It didn't feel like regret. It felt more like discovering you've been walking down a road for years without ever stopping to check the map. You keep moving forward because that's what people do. You assume the direction must be correct because it's the direction you've always taken. Until one day you pause long enough to look around, and suddenly you're not entirely sure how you got there. I stood up and turned off the kitchen light. The house fell into darkness except for the faint glow coming through the window from the streetlight outside. For a moment I stayed there, letting my eyes adjust. The silence felt deeper now, not empty, just wide. I walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. Usually by this point in the evening, I would turn on the television without thinking. Background noise filling the room while the night slowly passed. But I didn't reach for the remote. I just sat there, listening to the quiet. Something interesting happens when you stop distracting yourself. At first your mind moves faster. Thoughts jump around, trying to find something familiar to hold on to. Work tasks, small worries, plans for tomorrow. But if you stay in the silence long enough, those thoughts begin to slow down. And underneath them, something more honest begins to surface. That's when the second question appeared. Not about the past, about the future. If this life isn't exactly what I imagined, what would I change? The question was harder than the first one, because it required imagination. And somewhere along the way, I realized I hadn't used that part of myself in a long time. When you're younger, imagining different lives feels natural. You picture possibilities the way kids picture new worlds. Different cities, different careers, different versions of yourself. But adulthood slowly narrows those possibilities. Not in a cruel way, just through practicality. Bills, responsibilities, the quiet comfort of stability. And before you notice it, the life you once imagined becomes a life you maintain instead. I leaned back on the couch and stared at the ceiling. The truth was, I didn't want to destroy the life I had built. There was nothing wrong with it. The job paid well enough. The house was comfortable. My days moved with a predictable rhythm. Millions of people spend their lives hoping for that kind of stability. But something inside me had started asking a different question. Not is this good enough, but is this honest? Around midnight, I stepped outside again. The air had grown colder. The street was almost completely empty now. A single car moved slowly through the intersection at the end of the block before disappearing into the dark. I stood near the edge of the driveway and looked at the houses around me. Most of them were dark. Inside those houses were lives that probably looked a lot like mine. Routine, work, quiet evenings. People doing their best to move forward without disturbing the fragile balance they had created. And suddenly I understood something I hadn't seen before. The pressure I had been feeling for so long wasn't a signal that my life was wrong. It was a signal that my life had become automatic. Automatic living is easy. You follow the same schedule, make the same decisions, repeat the same conversations. Days pass smoothly because nothing unexpected interrupts them. But smoothness has a strange side effect. It slowly removes your sense of participation. You're still there, still doing everything you're supposed to do. But it begins to feel like you're watching your life instead of actively shaping it. I walked slowly down the sidewalk and then back toward the house. The cold air helped clear my head. And for the first time since the thought had appeared the night before, I realized something important. The truth I had avoided saying out loud wasn't meant to destroy my life. It was meant to wake me up inside it. That realization changed the feeling in my chest immediately. The pressure that had been there for months, maybe years, didn't disappear. But it shifted. It felt less like a warning, and more like an invitation. When I went back inside, the house felt slightly different. Not physically, just in the way I was experiencing it. The same walls, the same furniture. But now I was seeing them more clearly, as if the quiet honesty of the night had adjusted something inside my attention. I sat down at the kitchen table again, the same place where the thought had started. And for the first time, I asked myself something simple. Not about the entire future, not about dramatic change, just one small thing. What would make tomorrow feel slightly more like my own life? The question surprised me, because the answer wasn't complicated. It wasn't about quitting my job or moving across the country. It was smaller than that, more personal. I realized there were dozens of things I had quietly stopped doing over the years. Not because I didn't enjoy them, just because routine had slowly replaced them. Long walks without a destination. Calling old friends instead of waiting for messages. Spending time in places where no one expected anything from me. Small acts of participation in my own life. The more I thought about it, the more obvious it became. The distance I had been feeling between myself and my life hadn't appeared overnight. It had formed gradually through neglect. Not dramatic neglect, just the quiet habit of postponing things that mattered to me. Until eventually the days became efficient, stable, predictable, but slightly disconnected. I sat there for a long time after that, not planning anything, just letting the realization settle. Life didn't need to be replaced. It just needed to be lived more consciously. And maybe that was the thing I had never said out loud before. Not to anyone else, not even to myself. The truth was simple. I didn't need a different life. I just needed to stop moving through this one half asleep. Eventually, I turned off the lights and went to bed. The house was silent again, but the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt open. The questions that had followed me for so long were still there, but now they felt less like problems and more like directions waiting to be explored. Tomorrow morning would probably look exactly like every other morning. Coffee, traffic, work, the same familiar rhythm. But something inside me had shifted, and for the first time in years, I had the quiet feeling that I might finally start paying attention to the life I was already living. Not someday, not after something big happened, just tomorrow, which for the first time in a long while felt like it might be enough.